If you've gotten an ID, been arrested, or ever seen any crime movie,
I got a partial print with a tinted arch, is probably a thumb, and the fragment of a palm off the nail of Mrs. Leeds' left big toe.
you no doubt are familiar with the science of fingerprint identification. But if you're like I was before I started researching for this video, you may not be very familiar with where that science originated from. So, that's what I want to take a look at. Where did the science of fingerprints come from? Who actually conceptualized taking copies of them and using those for the purpose of identifying people? Well, as often the case with history is, the answer is kind of complicated. So let's get into it. As far back as 200 BC, records show use of fingerprints in ancient China as a seal for signatures on things like legal documents and trading agreements. As far as we know, they didn't have any way to specifically analyze each one or fully understand their uniqueness, but this does show at the very least an early association with fingerprints and identity. In 1686, Dutch anatomist Govard Bidlo published a book entitled The Anatomy of the Human Body. In this, he identifies the ridges on each person's finger, but didn't go as far as to suggest they were unique to that individual. In 1823, Czech anatomist, and forgive me if I butcher this, Jan Evangelista Porkien, wrote a thesis noting 9 distinct patterns in human fingerprints. As with others before him, he stopped short of saying these could be used for the purpose of identifying people. At this point, the scientific community still viewed this as a part of human anatomy that was probably mostly similar from person to person. In 1856, a British magistrate for the East India Company by the name of Sir William James Herschel found an interesting use for handprints. His job was to recruit laborers for the company, and they needed to sign contracts upon hiring. The problem was, most of them didn't speak or write in English, so they couldn't very well sign their name in it. As a workaround for this, he had them just sign with a full handprint, and it proved a remarkably effective way to keep track of his workers. The big breakthrough came in the late 1870s, though, with a Scottish doctor by the name of Henry Faulds. While accompanying a friend on an archaeological dig, he noticed the impressions the workers' fingers left in the moist clay. He began to study these and quickly theorized that they were unique to the specific person who left them. Shortly after this experience, the hospital he worked at was broken into, and police arrested a man Faulds believed to be innocent. So in order to help exonerate him, Faulds took impressions of his fingerprints and compared them with ones he had found at the crime scene. They did not match one another, and despite this being a cutting-edge science with practically no established history behind it, police were convinced enough by the evidence to release the man. In 1880, Faulds was so excited by his new discovery that he published a full thesis on the topic in a scientific journal called Nature. He even enlisted the help of Charles Darwin to help promote the idea abroad, but the latter was more interested in other things, so he passed it off to his cousin Francis Galton, who we'll hear back from in a little bit. Not one to be deterred, Faulds doubled down. He was so confident in his new system that he approached Scotland Yard and offered to start working on a fingerprint archive for them. He even said he would bankroll the project with his own money. The doctor was utterly convinced he had discovered something revolutionary. And in all fairness to him, he kinda had. Scotland Yard, of course, rejected it because this was just too new and weird. Plus, they were already using something called the Bertillon system, and were perfectly happy with it, so it didn't seem worth it to them at the time. The Bertillon system, for those who don't know, is a means of identification created by French researcher Alphonse Bertillon. As a former police officer, he recognized the need to identify suspects easily and accurately. So, he created a system involving several different measurements and photographic profiles. He checked things like height, cheek length, head length, and left forearm length, while taking several photographs from various sides of the individual. The system was predicated upon the belief that your skeleton didn't naturally change after 20 years old, which is kind of true in a way, but not enough so that it can be a basis for an accurate ID system. Obviously, there was some merit to the idea. We still use similar procedure with mugshots and driver's licenses. But the system overall had some very serious flaws. It remained the standard for 30 years, but started losing credibility really fast. And then something really embarrassing happens in 1903 that kind of destroys its whole basis. But we'll talk about that in a second. First, remember Darwin's cousin Francis?
Hold on to your lug nuts, it's time for an overhaul!
So in 1892, Francis finally releases the results of his work in a book titled Fingerprints. In this, he outlines what would basically become the foundation of modern fingerprinting. He establishes what fingerprints are, how they are made, ways one can collect and analyze them, as well as 3 distinctive pattern types. Additionally, he asserts that fingerprints stay the same for your entire life, and most importantly, no 2 fingerprints are alike. He also completely forgets to mention the fact that Faulds had created the science all this was initially based on.
In bird culture, this is considered a dick move.
That isn't to say Galton didn't expand upon it dramatically, but still, come on, man. In 1897, an Englishman by the name of Sir Edward Henry creates a classification system for fingerprints that is used still to this day. By 1899, Scotland Yard had adapted fingerprint identification as its primary method. In 1901, the New York Police Department followed suit. The final nail in the coffin for the Bertillon system comes in 1903, when a man named Will West is sentenced for a minor crime to the U.S. Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, a prison that still uses this method. When he arrives and they take his measurements, they inform him that he is already incarcerated in the prison, serving a life sentence for a murder charge. His measurements match an inmate named William West.
What the hell is even that?
Will obviously insists this isn't him, and soon the police realize they are actually 2 different people. Since the Bertillon system had identified the identical twins as the same person, they decide to try a fingerprint analysis, which, lo and behold, correctly IDs each of them individually. At this point, it was pretty clear to police departments around the globe fingerprinting was a vastly superior choice. Not only was it way less time-consuming, but it was much more accurate. In 1910, fingerprints were used for the first time in a criminal trial in the United States. A man named Thomas Jennings had been accused of murdering a man during a burglary. Police had discovered a fingerprint in a freshly painted rail that the robber had used to escape the residence. They went as far as to cut the entire railing out and bring it back to the station for analysis. The validity of this still very new science was heavily questioned by Jennings' defense team. His lawyer actually challenged the investigators to lift a print off a piece of paper he had touched, confident they wouldn't be able to do so. Obviously, this backfired terribly, as they easily lifted a full set of prints from the paper and matched them back to the attorney. The jury was strongly swayed by this information, and Jennings was found guilty and sentenced to death. From that moment on, fingerprint analysis became a common practice for law enforcement in the United States. And there you have it, guys and gals. That's the story of how fingerprints became a staple of modern criminal science. It's so easy to forget how long of a process this actually was, sitting in our cozy houses with fingerprint scanners on our cell phones. But this was a science that took hundreds of years and thousands upon thousands of hours of research to finally come into full bloom. I want to thank everyone for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. We will see you on the next one.